Hey everyone, Attorney Davis Younts here. Listen, this is part 3 in a 3-part series we're doing this week where we're talking about gerrymandering, the census, voter ID laws, and other issues where we see efforts being made to subvert not only the Constitution, but also kind of the social compact as well as the fundamental fabric of our republic. So one of the interesting things that's happened is there's a lot of discussion whenever we talk about voting, redistricting, the census, gerrymandering. One of the things that comes up, and in my opinion, this is directly tied to illegal immigration as well, is the question of voter ID laws. And dare I say that the liberal progressive talking point for voter ID laws is and has been from people like Chuck Schumer that voter ID laws are racist. In other words, Schumer will use very, very explosive, inflammatory language where he'll say that any kind of voter ID law is essentially bringing back the Jim Crow era, and it is being designed to prevent some specific group of people from voting. Now, first of all, I think that's offensive on its surface, the idea that there's some portion of the population, according to these Democrats like Chuck Schumer, that can't figure out how to get an ID or figure out how to vote without help. That's just absolutely absurd. But it's, I think, even offensive to try to tie in any kind of a voter ID law to the Jim Crow era. I mean, when we go back to the Jim Crow era, there are examples of things like poll taxes. In other words, in order to register to vote or to vote, there were locations where African Americans had to pay a tax. In other words, they had to pay money to vote. That was highly illegal. That was inappropriate. A poll tax is a ridiculous, should not be part of our government or system. That's not what anyone is doing. There is no way that anyone cannot afford to have a valid ID. It will be issued to them. If they can't afford it, there are ways around it. Everyone should have a social security number. Everyone should have some form of ID. That's not that hard to figure out. That's not a poll tax. The other thing that would happen during the Jim Crow era was that there would be literacy tests that would be done for people registering to vote. And again, these would be used to target African Americans, and they would do things like set a jar of jelly beans on a desk and say, guess how many jelly beans are the jar. In other words, they would set up a system in which the outcome could be controlled and impossible questions would be asked, and they would say, sorry, you're not literate enough to vote. Of course, that again would be illegal, inappropriate, discriminatory, but merely trying to secure the elections, to ensure that people are not voting illegally, to ensure that fake ballots aren't being put into the system, to ensure that votes are not watered down for American citizens. That is not a poll tax. That is not a Jim Crow era tactic. So again, fundamentally, as we look at this issue, we have to ask the question, why is it now, under our current political landscape, that it is Democrats, progressives like Chuck Schumer, who are against any kind of effort at all to ensure that our elections are safe and valid? That should be deeply troubling to any of us. And when you layer that in with things like the census counting illegal immigrants and having inflated numbers in blue states and deflated numbers in red states, that's a big problem, because all of this starts to come together and it all starts to feel like Democrats are pushing for all of these things with an agenda of trying to manipulate the system in order to gain political power. I am sorry. I don't care what your background is. I don't care what your political party is. From a legal perspective, as an attorney, no one should be voting that is not able to vote, is not legally permitted to vote in the location where they're voting. There should be no exceptions to that. And nothing about our elections is safe and secure or even valid if we don't do this. And even more so, we are undermining our representative system of government and our republic if we continue to allow this. One of the most dangerous things we could do as a nation is to move forward where a significant portion of the population rightly doubts the outcomes of elections. And people will say, oh no, there's not voter fraud. It's never been proven. No, it's never really been investigated. It was covered up after 2020, and we have issues with mail-in ballots. I could give you multiple examples of circumstances where people have been prosecuted and convicted for fraud. There was a case in Iowa in 2020. Kim Fong Taylor was convicted for submitting fraudulent absentee ballots. There was another case. Samunta Shimon Pittman faced 70 felony counts for falsifying voter registrations. There are multiple other cases where this has happened, and we know logically, if you have a scenario where there is mail-in ballots, where there has been no effort at all, and there are no rules in place to verify the identity of the people receiving or submitting the mail-in ballots, that creates an opportunity for a tremendous amount of fraud. Listen, no other nation in the world that is seen as anything close to advanced or modern or civilized does voting the way we do it in the United States with mail-in ballots and all of these other issues without voter ID. All of these other nations, most of these other nations do one day in-person voting, and they do that one day in-person voting, and the results are complete that day. Our voting has turned into a circus with these things. So why am I rambling on about that? Why is that such a big deal? It is fundamental to the future freedom and the cohesion and the social contract of our nation. But here's the good news. Historically, any efforts at voter ID to confirm the identity of voters have always been challenged by liberal progressive groups funded by Democrats to undermine any state efforts to do that. And they always challenge it politically by calling it Jim Crow era laws. And then they challenge it under the Civil Rights Act. And they hope that they get it in front of liberal, woke, progressive judges who really are after power and not concerned about our nation and preserving our republic. So what's happened is there's a very, very encouraging ruling from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. There was a legal challenge to voter ID laws in Texas for absentee ballots. In particular, there was a requirement that under this law that in order to be counted, an absentee ballot must have a portion of a social security number or some other form of ID to show it's not a duplicate, to show who actually received and submitted it, and give at least some level of guarantee of protection for mail-in ballots. Now, again, I'm not a fan of these mail-in ballots except for absentee ballots for legitimate reasons like military service, but otherwise, I am not a fan of these mail-in ballots. And it still creates concerns, but this was just a move in the right direction. And the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals has upheld the law. It has upheld the validity of this and has upheld, obviously and logically, that it's not a violation of the Civil Rights Act. It's not a violation of equal protection. That simply requiring some guarantee of authenticity is appropriate for these mail-in ballots in Texas. My hope is that other states will continue to follow suit with this now that you have really strong precedent from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. There's been no indication yet that this will be appealed to an en banc panel, so a full panel of the Fifth Circuit, or to the Supreme Court. But I think at any level, this type of bill, the way it's worded, would hold up, and it is certainly not a Jim Crow era poll tax or anything else. It is a logical step in the right direction to preserve free and fair elections. And again, this is something you've been hiding under a rock if you don't believe this is a critical issue to the future of the United States in order to get this right. And now we're seeing positive legal precedent being set. So, hey, this week we have talked about the history of gerrymandering and the census. I have made a case in video 1, if you want to go back and watch it, for why a census can be done properly, consistent with the Constitution, that does not count or include illegal immigrants. In video 2, we talked about almost funny in some respects, but critically important issue in Texas with Democratic state representatives. They're fleeing the state in order to avoid being present for a quorum out of their fear that the state of Texas will actually conduct their constitutionally mandated redistricting. And obviously there's huge issues with that. It sets terrible precedent. It's a violation of the social compact, but it's a big issue. So watch video 2 if you want to talk about that. Finally, in this video you just watched, we talked about some good news, a great case out of the Fifth Circuit that sets the precedent for states to actually start implementing reasonable voter ID laws. And listen, as I've said and repeated, these are critical issues. So thanks for watching the series. Thanks for following us on social media. If there's other topics you want to dive into, please let us know. And as always, thanks for watching. Take care. So at a very young age, I was 8 years old and my parents were involved in a lawsuit against the state of Pennsylvania with the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. That had an impact on me, being involved in that, understanding that. So I took that forward and had an interest in the law that I've carried with me. I took an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. So every military member does that. So if the military members' rights are not protected, they're not protected for the rest of society. These are the individuals that are actually willing to risk their lives to fight for the Constitution and to protect society.
It was this. If you are a Christian, you need to understand that part of your Christian walk, part of your faith journey, is that God is going to call you for a moment. There will be a phone call that comes from for you. And I ask you this, are you willing? Will you be willing when that phone call came? I praise God that I was willing to answer that call. It's why I'm here today. It's why I met some of the great men that are here, the people that are here.
So it's left to men like Davis Younts to fight for these Navy SEALs.
Yeah, so I was in law school when 9/11 happened, so I was a true believer back then, so I joined the Air Force, applied to the JAG Corps.
With reaction is Davis Younts, a military defense attorney with Younts Law. Davis, thank you for being here today.
Riley, it's always an honor to join you.
Davis Younts has been instrumental in defending service members that they tried to kick out of the military for not taking that poison.
So why are the politicians in Iowa allowing it?
Fear. They're afraid to take a stand and they're afraid to challenge this.
If you're a Christian, your sovereign king, the king of the universe, has already given you an order. Your king has made a call to go into all the world and make disciples. The only question for us is, will we answer it?